the paper really starts from a kind of puzzle that hits you when you first hear about Bayesianism, I think. And that is that Bayesianism has this incredibly, well, subjective Bayesianism. No, I'm not talking about objective Bayesianism particularly here, but subjective Bayesianism, or what people call moderate Bayesianism, which kind of adds in chance, credence principles like principle. Subjective Bayesianism is super permissive when it comes to the priors. So the credences that you have at the beginning of your epistemic life, or at the beginning, going into a particular experimental setup or something like that, is very, very permissive about those things, as long as they satisfy probabilism, your probability calculus, you're good to go. Or maybe you need to also have the principle, but even with that, it's incredibly permissive. But then when it comes to updating, it's incredibly impermissive. So it basically just says there's one way to update on evidence, and that's Bayesian conditionalization. I'm going to be talking here only about the sort of very standard case that Bayesianism is interested in with evidence, namely evidence learned with certainty. So when you just learn a proposition that you consider already, that you have credences in already, and you learn that proposition with certainty. So I'm not thinking about these cases that Jeffrey was interested in, for instance, where you learn something with which places some sort of constraints on your credences, but you don't learn anything with certainty. Just interested in the kind of just bog standard case. In that case, it's very impermissive when it comes to updating. It says, it's not that there's just this plethora of updating rules, all of them equally good in the way that it says about your priors. It says that there's really just this one conditionalization, and it's the only one that's permitted. Okay, now that's all reasonably vague, because what we mean by Bayesian conditionalization is reasonably vague. So I'm going to try to disambiguate. To some extent, I'm going to talk about three different norms that you might think of. They're not incompatible with one another, they're pretty much independent of one another. Although we'll see some arguments that connect them a bit later on. So actual conditionalization, and should I say that what they differ in is what they think the norm governs. So actual conditionalization thinks that the norm governs how in fact you update on the evidence that you actually receive. So all it's interested in is the priors that you had, the evidence you in fact received, and then what you did with that piece of evidence that you received. That's actual conditionalization. I'm going to spell them out in a bit more detail in a second. Planned conditionalization, on the other hand, thinks that the thing that you're assessing when you are stating the norm of Bayesian conditionalization is how you plan or intend to update your credences. So it's assessing some intentions that you have at the earlier time when you have your priors about what you will do if you receive certain sorts of evidence. Okay? And then finally, dispositional conditionalization governs what you're disposed to do. So your plans are something that you, in some sense, you might be aware of or not, but in some sense you tacitly endorse them. But your dispositions you needn't endorse, they may just be things that sort of happen to you, they're just part of your nature, and you might actually think they're pretty ropey. But nonetheless, you have these dispositions. What are your dispositions to update if you are sort of hit with a piece of evidence? So you're kind of thinking of updating an evidence along the kind of stimulus-response model. You get to the evidence as stimulus, what's your response? And those are your dispositions to update, and that's what the third sort of conditionalization talks about. So actual conditionalization, I won't go through all of these in detail, because it's probably reasonably obvious to you, but it basically says if C is your credence function at the earlier time, C prime is your credence function at the later time, and at your later time your total evidence is E, and your prior gave some positive probability to that proposition that states your total evidence, then your credence function at a later time should be the conditional probability relative to your earlier credences, conditional on E. So just see, the point is that all this is interested in is what actually happens, what evidence you actually receive, and what you in fact do in response. So, planned conditionalization, in contrast, thinks if C is your credence function at the earlier time, and your total evidence at the later time will be a proposition within some particular partition of the logical space. Okay? And then you have some updating plan, or an updating plan on this partition is basically a function that takes each of these possible bits of evidence and returns the credences that you're going to have in response to that, or that you'll endorse as reasonable in response to that evidence. Then your updating rule should exhort you to adopt a credence function, adopt this credence function, the conditionalizing credence function, when you receive this evidence, at least when you assign that evidence positive prior probability. So the point is that this has a lot more kind of structure built in. There's a lot more assumed here, namely that there is this partition of the logical space. Okay, so a set of mutually exclusive and exhaustive propositions, and you're going to learn exactly one of those by the later time, and that will give you your total evidence by that later time. And then what you're assessing when you're talking about plan conditionalization is the plan that you have now for what you will do in each of these different cases. So it's a kind of a conditional plan that says, if I receive this, then I'll do this, I'll receive this, I'll do this. So that's plan conditionalization.
Sorry,
Yeah.
Can I just ask a question? Why is it that you need the updating plan as a free parameter here? Because if we think that plan conditionalization requires whatever the updating plan is, then I don't see how different updating plans can actually make a material difference in what my credence state would be, because they all require that I respond to evidence in the exact same way. So in what sense could I meaningfully speak of different updating plans?
So your updating plan, so you could have a variety of different updating plans, say on this partition. It could be that in response to this evidence I will update by conditioning on the evidence, or I could update by conditioning and adding epsilon, or I could update by just choosing some completely arbitrary alternative thing, or I could update by just sticking with my prior. So they would all be different updating plans. And then this is telling me there's one that's the correct one to have. Is that?
Okay, so but the point. But the point is, since R is a free parameter in the definition of plan conditionalization, that suggests that there could still be multiple updating plans that satisfy this, right? But the idea is that plan conditionalization basically is supposed to be like a filter that excludes all updating plans except for the ones that conform to basic Bayesian conditionalization.
Right. I mean, this is just. What do you mean by being a free parameter? I mean, I was just thinking that
because
this just says if you have this, if this is your prior and this is your plan for how you'll update, then it better be that the plan exhorts you to adopt this.
Okay.
So, I feel like that's not answering the question though. The thought is just, I've got, the idea is I've just got two sorts of cognitive state around at the moment. One of them is my priors, and it's just a credence function of the positions. The other one is a plan, and it's just a function from these to some credence function. From each of these, it tells me which credence functions would be kind of I endorse as a possible response to that piece of evidence. And now now what this is supposed to tell you is a way in which these two things should relate to one another, your prior credence and your updating plan. It should be your updating plan is the one that tells you choose to update exactly by conditioning on the prior. Okay, so it's meant to be a rule that governs pairs, priors, and updating rules together. Yeah. So then dispositional conditionalization is just kind of the next. It's just the kind of obvious adjustment of this, where we're talking not about plans to update, but dispositions to update. So, so this just says, look, there's two things, two sort of bits of your cognitive state that we're interested in here. One of them is your prior credences, the other is your updating plans. Sorry, your updating dispositions. So it's an updating plan you're disposed to follow. So then that updating plan, those dispositions should be in line with conditionalization. So there should be, in a sense, nothing kind of particularly new here, but I think it's helpful to sort of separate out these different things that conditionalization could be governing. Part of the reason for separating them out is that most people in introductory things or in sort of slightly informal presentations of Bayesianism talk as if their actual conditionalization is the norm they're interested in, but what the arguments, or what many of the arguments, particularly the arguments I'm going to consider here, what they really show is that plan conditionalization or dispositional conditionalization is true, and then there's a separate question can you go from arguments that justify those two to an argument to a justification for actual conditionalization? We'll come on to that in a little bit later on, or I think later on. I'm going to consider, so basically, the line is going to be, we've got this sort of strange discrepancy between the synchronic norms for Bayesianism, which are super permissive, allow lots of different things, the diachronic norms for conditionalization, these for Bayesianism, namely the ones we've just looked at, they're very, very restrictive, namely they really only allow a certain one single sort of updating is legitimate. Initially that looks problematic, or it looks sort of troubling, it looks like it calls out for explanation. We standardly don't worry about it because we think that the same arguments that give us the permissivism in the synchronic case also give us the restrictiveness in the diachronic case. Arguments like the Dutch book argument or the accuracy-based argument, both of those we have good Dutch book arguments for probabilism, so for the very kind of permissive norm in the synchronic case, but the equivalent to that, or the natural analogue to that, looks like it's going to justify conditionalization in the diachronic case, so it's going to justify the very restrictive thing. And the same thing seems to happen in the accuracy argument. They, something like Jim Joyce's argument for probabilism is going to give you probabilism, this very permissive norm, in the synchronic case, but when you look to the diachronic case, arguments like Hilary Graves and David Wallace's expected accuracy argument, or an argument I'll talk about later on, they're going to give you conditionalization, this very restrictive norm in the diachronic case. So in a sense it looks like the puzzle's sort of solved. But the problem is, and the kind of problem I'm interested in this paper is, that in order for each of these arguments to work, you have to assume a particular thing about your updating rules, namely that they're deterministic. Okay, and what is a deterministic rule? Well, we'll come back to it a little bit later on, but essentially the idea is, think about plan conditionalization, where we're thinking about the plans that you have for updating. So you have this particular partition. What's an updating rule? Well, I was saying it's a function that takes any evidence that you might receive, and it gives back whatever credences you endorse as legitimate responses to those. Now, typically, we assume that that set of credence functions that's a legitimate response to, say, this first piece of evidence is a singleton. It's just a single thing that I endorse as a particular response to that evidence. But there doesn't seem to be any reason for making that assumption. We could think that, in fact, for any particular piece of evidence you get, there's a whole set of different possible posteriors that you think of as legitimate responses to that piece of evidence. Okay, that would be a sort of non-deterministic norm. It wouldn't say, if I learn this piece of evidence, then I will adopt this credence function. Rather, it would say, if I learn this piece of evidence, then I could adopt this credence function, I could adopt that one, or I could adopt that one, and I think that they're all legitimate responses to that evidence. In each of these arguments, as we'll kind of see, and we'll go through in a little bit, each of these arguments is based on the assumption that your updating rules must be deterministic. And that's what essentially gives us this very restrictive or impermissive diachronic norm, whereas the arguments gave us very kind of permissive norm in the synchronic case. And so the question is, well, it's true that in the standard presentations of these arguments, or the standard proofs of the theorems that underlie them, we always assume this kind of deterministic updating fact, that the plans that we have should be deterministic, plans for updating that we have should be deterministic. But is there a way of rerunning these arguments without that and still getting back conditionalization? And the answer roughly is sometimes yes, sometimes no, and I'm going to try to explain when yes and when no. So roughly the result's going to be that this will never get you back conditionalization. These two can, but only on a particular way of understanding how to run them. And this one is particularly bad. As you do. Okay, so here's an example. Okay, so here's our standard sort of picture of conditionalization. So I'm interested in a hurricane that's just off the south coast of America, let's say, and I know that it's going to make landfall at exactly one of 4 sites. Panama City, Pensacola, which are both in Florida, and Mobile and Biloxi, which are not in Florida. And these are my current credences in these different possibilities. Should have it up to 1. Okay, so those are my current credences in those possibilities, and I've got I know someone who, the hurricane has now made landfall, but I don't know where it landed, and I know someone who does know, and I asked them, did it land in Florida or not? And they're going to say it did or it didn't. If it did, then I'm going to update in this way, usual sort of story. I wipe out the credences from the possibilities that my evidence rules out, so these get 0, and then I renormalize. And similarly, if the person says not Florida, I wipe out the possibility, the Florida possibilities, reallocate the credence onto that. So that's standard conditionalization. I receive the evidence like this. I'm planning to receive the evidence, and then there's going to be a single response that I'll endorse as legitimate in response to that evidence, and it's going to be the standard conditionalizing. But now think about the following sort of person who decides not to do that. What they decide to do instead is this. So they have the same priors, and they're going to ask the same question, and so there's the 2 possible bits of evidence they might receive are the same. But instead of saying, whichever I receive, there's a single thing that I endorse as the right response to that, they're going to say, actually, whichever I receive, there are 2 things that I'm going to consider as legitimate responses to that. Okay, so if I hear that it's Florida, I'll either do this, either put my credence in Panama City up to 0.7 and credence in Pensacola up to 0.3, or I'll do this, put my credence in Panama City up to 0.8 and my credence in Pensacola down to 0.2. Again, then 0 for the other ones, and then similarly in a kind of mirror image for the not-F cases. So this is a case where I've got a non-deterministic updating rule. It says, I'm going to receive one of either of these. If I receive this one, then there's 2 things that I'm going to consider legitimate. If I can receive this thing, I'm going to be 2 that I consider legitimate.
Are you telling us what probabilities? With what probabilities are you taking these? Because
not at the moment. I will later on, and that's going to. So that's going to turn out to be, as you're probably seeing already, is going to be where the crucial thing is. If those can get probabilities, then there's going to be ways of recovering conditionalization. If not, then we're going to see that there won't be. So yeah, that's good. Yeah.
I feel that you're slipping between 2 different ways of talking. One is about what's permissible or what's legitimate, I think is the word you're using, and then the other one is what you think you will in fact do.
Yeah.
But those things seem to me that they can go apart.
They're going to be different. Okay, good. So that's partly slipping between the plan version of the argument and the dispositional version of the argument. Okay, in the plan version of the argument, it's all about what I think would be legitimate. So when I plan to update in a particular way, I'm saying these would be kind of my endorsed responses, if you like. I mean, I'm not sure exactly what kind of normative language you want to use about it, but it's something like these. These are the ones that I intend to have, where the intention is non-deterministic, right? So it's something like, it's a little bit like, I think I mentioned this earlier when we were discussing it's like when if I were to say, well, tomorrow if it's sunny, then I'll go for a walk. If it's raining, then I'll read a book or I'll read the newspaper. So it's an intention, it's the thing that I endorse doing in response to that, but I'm not saying I have any kind of particular prediction that I will do one or the other, and I don't. There's no sense in which I can put a probability on doing one or the other, because I'm just saying both of them are permissible, both of them are kind of things that I would consider correct responses to them. So they're not predictions. If, on the other hand, I'm looking at the kind of the argument for dispositional conditionalization, then I am going to be thinking of these as, I'm going to say, well, if I receive that, then I'll either do this or I'll do that. And then in that case, it does look much more likely that you could put probabilities over the 2 things. So that's going to come up a little bit later on. But yeah, so that slippage is just is because of that. Okay, so as we're going to see, the arguments, these 4 arguments, for conditionalization rely on this premise, which I've already talked about, that your updating plan should be deterministic, by which we just mean for each of the possible bits of evidence you think you might receive, you think there's only one credence function, or set of credences that's a legitimate response to it. You don't think, you're not, so you're like this person and not like this person. Okay. So that's the assumption. And I'm going to sort of say, well, look, in the standard presentations of the argument, that assumptions has to be there in order for them to work, and then ask the question, can we recover the arguments if we remove that? I should say something about the arguments I'm looking at. So I'm looking at these 4 arguments. The diachronic Dutch book argument, which is perhaps the most well-known for this. The expected pragmatic utility argument, which seems to be a lot less well-known, but is essentially a kind of spin on Good's value of information theorem. Hilary Gray's and David Waltz's accuracy argument, and then this accuracy dominance argument that Ray Briggs and I gave. Now you might think, well, that's 4 out of a kind of a plethora of arguments for conditionalization. That's true. So this paper is restricted in that sense. And there's a question about whether arguments like sort of Van Frassen style or Groven-Halperin style symmetry arguments are going to, whether they rely also on this assumption of deterministic updating or these minimal change arguments that people are interested in. So that's kind of future work. At the moment I'm just interested in these kind of particular arguments. And I call them teleological arguments because in a sense the thought is I judge the rationality of a particular credal item like a credence function or an updating rule or a pair of these things by looking at how good they are along a certain dimension. So either their pragmatic goodness, how good they are as guides to action or decision-making credences, or their epistemic goodness in some sense, their representational goodness, how good they are as ways of representing the world, and that's where the accuracy their arguments come in. So that's why I'm looking at those kind of 4 arguments. They kind of fit naturally together. They always have this teleological form, but they're not exhaustive. So there's further work to be done there. Okay. So before I get onto the arguments, I just want to talk about the relationship between these latter 2 versions of the argument: plan conditionalization and dispositional conditionalization. How they relate to actual conditionalization. Because I think there are routes from either of those 2 back to actual conditionalization, and those I think are really the only routes that the standard arguments are going to give us back to actual conditionalization. And so it turns out if we can't justify plan conditionalization or diachronic physics conditionalization using the arguments that I'm going to be talking about, then we're not going to have these routes to actual conditionalization. Okay, so here's the first one. And in a way I think this is the most popular, though in a funny way I think it's the least plausible, partly because it's got 3 pretty strong premises, each one of which has been and can quite plausibly be denied. So the first premise is that you always know the partition from which the evidence will come. So you kind of know that your evidence will either be E1 or E2 or so on up to En. Now I think there are kind of situations where that is reasonably plausible, like the yes-no questions or the Florida, not Florida questions. That seems like it's reasonably plausible. In that situation, I know the kind of limited partition from which the responses might come and the propositions that I'll learn by the later time. That's more typically just kind of wandering around the world, not being particularly sure what sort of evidence you might encounter. It's much less clear that you know which partition the evidence will come from. Second premise says if you know the partition, you have to plan how you're going to respond to it. I mean, people like Van Frassen are just going to say, no, there's no rational requirement to plan to do anything. And in fact, there's this kind of interesting parallel here with the debate in kind of action theory about what the kind of rational role of intentions and plans are. Is it possible to be a rational agent who never makes any plans, who kind of just does things that are internally consistent from time to time, but never makes plans at one time for what they'll do at a later time? And then the third premise is also relevant to that. When you plan, you have to follow through on it. So there's a sort of principle that in the action theory case is called something like diachronic continence by people like Michael Bratman and Sarah Paul. And there's also, good reasons for denying that as well, that although, maybe it's very helpful to make intentions and usually follow through with them, there's actually no particular rational compunction in any particular case once you've made a plan to follow through on it. Even if you haven't received any evidence in between that would counteract the plan. Okay. So, but what if you could get those three? Having been rather negative about them, if you could get those three, then you could move from plan conditionalization to actual conditionalization. Because whatever it is that you, if you in fact didn't actually conditionalize, then it will have to be the case that you violated one of these norms. Here's another possibility. You could think, well, here's what's wrong with actually not updating by conditionalization. We do, in fact, have dispositions that govern how we're going to update this. That's the sort of fact about us. There are dispositions you can specify that say how you will in fact respond, or might in fact respond, in response to particular pieces of evidence. If then you don't update by conditionalization, then that must be the manifestation of one of those dispositions, and that shows that that disposition was not to conditionalize, and then if you've got an argument for having dispositions that are conditionalizing dispositions, then you've got an argument for actual conditionalization. So that's a possibility. That one I think looks a lot more hopeful. And then the final one, which is a kind of standard move in the Bayesian canon, is to say, well, even if in fact you don't plan, and even if in fact you didn't know what the partition was from which your evidence would come, you should be at least representable as if you did. You should update in such a way that it's as if you did know in advance some partition from which the evidence would come, and you made some plan beforehand, and then you followed through on that plan. So while it might not in fact be incumbent on you now to actually have those plans and to know where the evidence might come from and to follow through on those plans, nonetheless you shouldn't update in a way that couldn't be recovered by a third party as rationalising you as by imposing those things on you, by assuming you do have them. So those are some ways to move. Okay, so let's get down to the four different arguments and how they work with this assumption of deterministic updating, how they need it, and what happens when you remove it. Okay, so this is just a little bit about the framework, just a sort of notation really as much as anything else. I'm just going to keep everything very, very simple because all the problems that are going to arise in the kind of simplest toy, very, very small finite cases. And in fact, that case we had with the hurricane landing in Florida or not in Florida is going to give us all of the issues that we might potentially come up against here. So I'm just going to assume it's a finite algebra of propositions that the Credence functions are defined over. I'm going to assume that they're all probabilistic in this sort of case. The updating rule is defined on a finite partition, and that finite partition belongs to this, so that all the different pieces of evidence that the agent might in fact receive are ones that they already consider. This is not a kind of Jeffrey-style case where some piece of evidence comes in which is represented by a proposition you haven't entertained before. So a rule defined on that's going to be represented as a series of sets of Credence functions. So essentially the thought is a rule is just for each element of this a specification of some set of Credence functions, and those are the Credence functions that, if you're thinking about these as a plan, then they're the ones that you endorse as responses to that piece of evidence. If you're thinking it's a disposition, then they're the ones that you might in fact adopt in response to that evidence. So yeah, that's basically what this says. CI contains the posteriors that your rule endorses as a response to that piece of evidence. We'll come back to this, but this is basically just a new proposition which may not already be in the set of things that you entertain. A new proposition which just says that you learn that piece of evidence and you respond by adopting this particular function. I'll come back to when we're going to use that, I'll come back to it. And so what it means for a rule to be deterministic is just that each one of these is going to be a singleton set. Just that means that for each piece of evidence there's just one single unique Credence function you think is the right response to that evidence. Okay, so that's the framework. Okay, that's just a picture of the framework. So this is your prior, these are the different bits of evidence you might get in. You might have some cases where there's just a single prudence function you think is the correct response to it, like these ones, and then another one where, say, there's two different prudence functions that you're fine with being the response. It's just to reuse that diagram as much as possible. Okay. So what's a conditionalization rule for a particular prior? Well, it's just exactly what you'd expect it to be. It's just that for every piece of evidence, as long as you assign a positive probability, then in that case, the rule just assigns a single, just endorses a single credence function. That single credence function is just the conditionalized credence function. So that's just the kind of standard thing. So R's conditionalizing rule if it tells you to conditionalize. Big surprise. Second, this is maybe a little bit less familiar. A super conditionalizing rule. So I think Diaconis and Zabala are the first ones to talk about this, but I think the name is maybe due to Richard Jeffrey. I'm not particularly sure of that, but anyway, he does use that name. So the thought is this: when is something a super conditionalizing rule? Well, it's where you expand the algebra of propositions that you assign credences to. Well, not whether you actually assign credences to. So you take the algebra that you in fact assign credences to. So yes, this is your F. That's the thing you actually assign credences to, and you expand it to include. So let's F plus. It's a much or reasonably larger set. And that's to include propositions that specify what credence function you adopt in response to a particular piece of evidence. So it's basically to expand it to include these propositions that we had a couple of slides ago, these ones which tell you not only what you learned, because that's already in there, that's already in EI, each EI is in here, so they're already in there, but a proposition that says both that and what credence function you adopted in response to that. So something is a super conditionalizing rule. If you can expand... Sorry, yeah.
So does this depend on... Are we thinking here of in particular dispositional? Because I used to have a little bit of conceptual problem with assigning a probability to what plan I will endorse.
Yeah, so at the moment this is just purely on the formal level. It's just a description of when a particular rule counts as super conditionalizing for this. The extension isn't real in a sense, right? So you don't actually expand out the set of credences you assign. It's just saying this is going to count as this is going to count as a super conditionalization rule for this. If we could imagine expanding the credences out to this much larger algebra, and once we had expanded them out in that way, the priors that you have are basically the result of conditionalizing on the fact that you learned that evidence and you responded in that particular way to it. So it's sort of, it's saying that, a rule is a super conditionalizing rule if it can be understood as if it were really a conditioning rule, but on this much larger set of propositions, where the larger set of propositions includes ones that tell you, in fact, what you did, how you did respond to it. So that's what it is to be super conditionalized.
And of course, that extension is understood in the way that it preserves the probabilities of all the events which were in.
Sorry, yes. So a genuine extension. So it's it agrees with that. It agrees with the original thing on this. That's right, absolutely. Yes. So. Okay, so that's what it means for something to be super conditionalizing rule for a particular credence function. Basically, I should just, in case this is sort of looking confusing, in the case where you've got deterministic rules, the super conditionalizing rules just are the conditioning rules, right? Because this proposition just is EI, because you already have those propositions inside, because there is just a single thing that you will update to upon receiving that particular piece of evidence. You don't need to also specify what thing, what credence function you endorse. So this is something different from conditionalizing only in the cases where you have these non-deterministic rules. But it is a constraint on those. It does. So it's not trivial. There are going to be things that don't. One thing to just note, if it's in case it helps at all, this is going to be a super conditionalizing rule. there's a way of expanding out the algebra based on just these 4 propositions, so that so that my worlds are no longer just these 4 worlds, but each of these worlds plus a specification of which credence function I adopted in response to the evidence that I would get at that world. So it'd be a world like Panama City, and whenever it's Panama City, I'm going to learn this piece of evidence, right? And also, I adopted this credence function response to it. Those are then going to be the new worlds for my expanded algebra. Is there a way of putting credences over those, over that more expanded thing, again probabilistically, such that this is in fact the result of conditionalizing that expanded prior? If people are aware of kind of like the Jeffrey conditioning literature, Jeffrey talks about this as a way of understanding what's going on with Jeffrey conditioning. So, you know, when he's talking about that, kind of seeing that piece of cloth by candlelight, and there not being any proposition that kind of perfectly matches the thing that you learn in that situation, he says, okay, we should at least, or this is kind of really dichotomisms about it, you should at least update in such a way that I can recover what you've done as rational had you already had credences in that particular proposition. So expand out your algebra to include a proposition that expresses exactly that thing, and then you conditionalize on that, and he has to say what it would mean to conditionalize. But yeah, okay. So that's super conditionalizing. Is that reasonably clear? Because that's going to turn out that's quite big. Okay, so that's super conditionalizing. Okay, so Dutch book argument. So the diachronic Dutch book argument. How does it go in the usual sort of case? This is just a kind of overview in case people haven't come across this before or have duly forgotten it. So standard synchronic Dutch book argument just says, look, you're incoherent, and incoherence is bad. If there is a series of bets, and I can get you to accept every single one of them individually, the credences will lead you to accept every single one of them individually, but taken together they're going to lose you money for sure. How do you expand that to the diachronic case? Well, let's just think about a deterministic case, where all of our rules now are deterministic updates, so because this is the standard way in which this argument is usually framed. So a pair, which includes a prior and an updating rule, is incoherent if there's a series of bets at the first time, and for each piece of evidence that you might receive, a series of bets at a later time, such that your prior requires you to accept each of the bets at the first time. And for each of the pieces of evidence you might receive, the particular credences that you adopt in response to that requires you to accept each bet given the later time. But, taken together, those bets are going to be guaranteed to lose your money. Okay, that's what a diachronic Dutch book argument is going to be. Okay, so Lewis shows that a particular pair, if there's a prior and a rule, is going to be incoherent, so bad in this sense, make you vulnerable to sure loss, just in case it's not a conditionalizing rule for C. So the only things that are going to make you invulnerable to incoherence are conditionalizing rules. Okay, good. All looks good. Looks like we get conditionalization, but of course we assumed deterministic updating in order to get it. What happens if we take this off? Well, notice what. So there's a question about what is. What sort of bets is it legitimate to make? What sort of series of bets is it such that if they lose me money for sure, that will show that I'm irrational? What sort of series of bets is it that reveal my irrationality? So here's a reasonable thing. Suppose we're in the non-deterministic case, so or the very general case where we're just not assuming whether it's deterministic or not. Now suppose there's some series of bets that I have at the first time. And then for each piece of evidence I might receive, and each possible response that I'll endorse, I'll just use the endorse language, the kind of language of plans at the moment, for each evidence I might receive and each credence function I'll endorse, some series of bets at that later time, after I get them, such that my prior requires me to accept all the first bets, and for each piece of evidence I receive and response to it that I endorse, that response requires me to accept each of the bets in this. But for every world, so for every piece of evidence I might receive and every world in which that piece of evidence is true, then the bets that I will be made to accept by my credences in those worlds will lose me money.
So the second is for each EI and for each C prime in CI.
Yes, that's right. Sorry. But this is relativized to that C prime.
Okay.
Yeah.
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 C prime. Okay, good.
Yeah. Otherwise, it would be kind of unreasonable, right?
Yes.
Yeah. Because if I stood up some other thing, I shouldn't be accepting. It shouldn't be meant to accept things that my alternatives would do. Yeah. No, that's good point. So that's really crucial, right? So this is different from the previous slide. These bets are relativized to that. Then this is basically just rerunning the argument, but now just not assuming deterministic updating in its place. You're just going to get that a prior and an updating rule is incoherent, just in case it's not a super conditionalizing rule for C. So essentially, basically the thought is that in order to avoid diachronic Dutch books, you don't need to have a conditionalizing rule. You just need to have a super conditionalizing rule. If you're deterministic, then that's just the same thing. But you could get out of having a diachronic Dutch book just by not satisfying deterministic updating, not having a deterministic rule. So to see how dramatic that is, look back at this original example and note that this is your prior, and each one of these is not a result of conditionalizing on the evidence you receive. So you've sort of maximally violated what we thought of as conditionalization. Right? You've not at any point satisfied it. You don't endorse any conditionalized credences. Nonetheless, there can't be a Dutch book against this pair of credences. That is, there can't be a series of bets here plus a series of bets here, 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 where this one will require you to accept these bets, this one will require you to accept the bets made there, and so on for these ones, and such that for all worlds within F, this and this will, the bets there and there will end up losing you money. So that's sort of odd, right? I mean, it's sort of a bit more than odd, I think. Because, okay, so why is it odd? I think the reason is that I think the reason is that what we wanted from diachronic Dutch book arguments, or what I wanted from them, it's possibly not what others want from them, but what I wanted from them was a sort of vindication of a reasonably intuitive sense that conditionalization is the right way to update. Now you might think, okay, well you get that as long as you assume deterministic updating. Deterministic updating looks super intuitive. The conditionalization already looked super intuitive to me, so I didn't want someone to tell me why it could follow once I make some other intuitive assumption. I wanted to learn why it makes my credences good for decision making. It was meant to teach me a very particular thing about credences, namely that they're sort of the guide to life, right? That they are a good way of guiding our actions. But if it turns out that I don't get conditionalization unless I make this deterministic updating assumption, I haven't been told what's so bad from the point of view of guiding your actions in something that's non-deterministic. That's the puzzle. That's what I thought.
So is non-deterministic in the context of the plan equivalent to permissive?
Yeah, so that's how I was thinking. That's how I was thinking of it. Yeah, exactly. So you think in response to any particular piece of evidence, not any particular, in at least one piece of evidence, you're permissive about how you might. You don't think there's a unique thing that is the only way to respond.
Could you then address the question with the framework of imprecise probabilities, or can you maybe comment on what difference there is?
That's a really good question. Not one I have a very great answer too. So you were thinking, well, essentially what happens here is you think that how you update here is not to a single previous function, but instead to a set, namely the one that has both of those in it.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I mean, I think that would be a rather different model, okay? So I think there are certainly people, so Jennifer Carr, I think something like this, that what we do when we model someone with imprecise credences is we essentially think that that's the set of all precise credences that would be permissible for the person to have. But other people, of say the kind of Jim Joyce, and actually I think a lot of the imprecise community will think these are actually dramatically different sorts of mental states. So these ones are sort of super committed. They tell you very precise things about the differences between these things. And if I'm just working all within this precise framework, then this tells you that there's this this particular problem, that were I to learn this, then I could be permissive about them. Not in the sense that I'm adopting an imprecise, but rather that I'm not deterministic. I'm not specifying a particular precise one that I'm going to adopt. And they look like quite different actions, adopting an imprecise one versus saying that it's permissible for me to adopt either of the precise ones. Does that make sense? They're going to say those are...
I mean, is that not just an interpretational question that should not matter too much for the formal solution?
Yeah, that's absolutely. The question would be, you see, if I interpret this non-deterministic rule as a deterministic rule that gives out imprecise credences, one problem is the decision theory for imprecise credences is very vexed, right? There's not a particularly good one that satisfies all principles. And so you would have to, and you're going to need that if you're going to kind of create Dutch book arguments, or say something meaningful about Dutch book arguments. And so, yeah, I mean, I think that's one thing to say. The other thing to say is, I mean, I know enough about the imprecise stuff to know how they want to justify their particular ways of updating. But essentially, a similar problem is going to arise for imprecise credences, right? Because for imprecise, people are going to say, okay, so I start off here with my imprecise probabilities, and then I learn a particular proposition, and then how am I going to update? Now, the way they talk, again, they assume deterministic updating. They assume there's just one imprecise creedal state that they could respond. But you could equally say, well, why make that assumption? Why is it not the case that I could either adopt this imprecise or adopt that imprecise? I mean, the kind of way your question was going, it suggested that maybe that's not even a possibility to have a non-deterministic updating rule. What they would be doing in that case is committing to adopt some imprecise state that collects together both of the other things. But I mean, I guess I don't know enough about what they want to say to say how that would. Yeah.
So, just to make sure that I've kind of got the thread of the argument here. So, the worry is that if we imagine cases where we think about what we do in response to getting a piece of evidence here, and you say, well, what is it that would actually exclude the indeterministic updating in this way that allows this? You say, well, could we try to exclude or rule out this indeterministic updating by thinking about diachronic Dutch books? And then what you just showed on the previous slide is no, that doesn't actually work, because if we think about the right kind of superconditionalization rule, that actually can generate this kind of updating scheme. And so it's not actually incoherent in the right way with Dutch books.
Right.
Okay, so the question is, well, what is it then that we can actually identify as the thing that is wrong about this kind of updating rule? Because this, as you said, seems weird. Okay. So maybe my question. So the question is this: maybe the problem is that there's diachronic Dutch book arguments don't really quite look at the right feature of updating to handle these kinds of cases, because that's looking about, say, loss of money or what we would actually make ourselves vulnerable to. Whereas what seems to be going on in this case is something kind of related to the idea of imprecise probabilities. What we have is kind of a violation of conservation of information or something from the earlier state to the later state, because we go from a very sharp estimate, and we're given very sharp information as evidence that we're supposed to update on. But then if you think about this as precise probability sense of
Right.
we go from sharp plus sharp equals fuzzy in
Yeah.
terms of the outcome.
Yeah.
And that seems to violate some kind of principles of information.
Right. I think.
So maybe
yeah.
we need to think about it from that point of view rather than
Yeah.
just, what do I make myself vulnerable to from the point of view of being a money point?
Yeah. So I think that is basically the right. Well, so I don't think that's the right way to go, but I think that's the way that you, the only way that's in some sense open in this is, so I think you could, and when people sort of respond to this sort of thought, they often say something about evidence, or look, if you've got a particular, precise piece of evidence, it should elicit a kind of a particular response. And in some sense, there's nothing about that I want to deny. It's not the way I want to go with my kind of justifications of creedal norms, but I don't think there's anything kind of bad about it. What's interesting though is that it goes well beyond what the Dutch, because the Dutch book kind of arguments were supposed to do, because you might think, look, if we could appeal to sort of intuitions about evidential support and information and things like that, then we would get we could get out some of these things much earlier on. So for instance, a natural thing to think is, well, when I receive a new piece of evidence, then it shouldn't change anything about my conditional probabilities for in the next update. If you get that, then you just get conditionalization straight out. So I take it that part of what the Dutch book arguments were trying to do was move. I mean, of course, it's not like they don't appeal to ground rock principles that have to be justified by intuition, but they were attempts to remove kind of intuitions about things like preservation of information or evidential support or intuitive judgments about what seemed like reasonably fuzzy sorts of concepts from the justifications of these principles. Now you might not think there was any need to do that. You might think these kind of fuzzy intuitions are perfectly good as ways of justifying these things, but it definitely looks like it's not in the spirit of the Dutch book. Yeah, okay, well, also one thing I think you could respond is what I'm going to come on to in the next one. So the expected pragmatic utility argument. So this is, I always find it slightly surprising this one isn't more discussed, but in any case, this is a nice argument due to Peter Brown, I don't know anything more about other than this paper. And it's basically, if people know Good's value of information theorem, it's sort of some sort of switch on that. So the thought is something like this. Suppose we've been talking as if there's these two times, the time when you have your priors, time when you learn the evidence and you update your posteriors. But suppose there's some further later time after that when you're going to have to make a decision. Okay, you're going to be faced with a decision between a bunch of different choices and you're going to use your updated credences, your posteriors, to make that choice. You could, from the present point of view, judge how good an updating rule would be by how good you expect the credences that it will give rise to as being at making that decision. So you value future credences for their ability to make that decision well. Okay, so let's just see how that works out, kind of a little bit formally. So we're in the deterministic setting, okay, deterministic updating. Utility of an updating rule is the utility of the option that is required. So, okay, so the thought is this: I'm going to be able to assign. So usually, of course, we're assigning utilities to options, alternatives between which you choose. But I can use that to define the utility of an updating rule at a particular world. What is that utility? Well, it's the utility of an updating rule at a particular world is the utility of the option that the credence function that updating rule at that world will endorse would choose from the decision problem that I'll face at a later time. Now, of course, there's a bad definite article in there because, of course, in some decision problems there won't be some unique option that will maximise expected utility with respect to my posterior credence function. But it turns out you can sort that out. So let's just put that off to the side for the moment. The thought is that I'm going to value my current, I'm going to value an updating rule at a particular world by the value of the action that it will lead me to choose were I to follow it at that world. Because at that world I'm going to get in particular, so if that world is within this cell of the partition, I'll receive this piece of evidence, I'll update to this credence function, and then A superscript Ci is just going to be the act that CI would lead me to choose when I'm faced with the decision problem at a later time. Okay. So how good is an updating rule? It's only as good as the option you'll end up choosing if you follow through on it in this world. Suppose you do that, then Brown shows that a particular updating rule maximizes expected utility from the point of view of the prior Green's function, if it's a conditionalization. Okay, you might see how that's related to Good's argument, because Good's argument is that if you know you're going to make a decision later on and someone offers you evidence for free, and you know you're going to update it by conditioning on that evidence, then you should take that free evidence, because it will always make you better. Yeah?
So I just have a question about the utility of an updating rule. So doesn't that mean that the utility of the rule is just entirely fixed by what actually happens when you're presented with evidence? And so so the utility of the rule is kind of a hostage to fortune. Right? I mean, maybe you've got, because I can just imagine, maybe I've got an updating rule that is just brilliant in all kinds of counterfactual cases, because I've been planning and thinking about contingency plans and so on, but it just so happens that the actual evidence I'm presented is like the one place where the rule is really pretty crappy.
Right.
Then doesn't it kind of say that the overall rule has extremely low utility, even though it might have been fantastic in all these counterfactual cases that weren't actually realized with the evidence that was presented?
Yeah, that's fair enough. So in one sense, it's not going to be a particularly good judge of the rule kind of as a modal entity, if you like, as something that gave some verdicts in all these counterfactual cases. So this is a kind of very hard-headed way of valuing a rule. It's only good at a particular world insofar as it gets me something at that world. It doesn't really matter what it would have done had the world been different. But of course, that will then get factored into this calculation because each world is considered in the expected utility calculation. So it's not like rules like that will somehow get oddly valued from the expected utility thing. But you're right, there's a sense in which this is not the best measure of. But if all I care about is what I will in fact, how much value I'm going to get, how much utility I'm going to get after I make my decision later on, then I'm going to want a rule that just does well, and that's at the world that I in fact inhabit. And so that princes over that. So that's what Brown shows. Okay, but what happens if you move to the non-deterministic case? Now, in this case, it's a bit different from the Dutch book case, because there are two different sorts of response, and basically one of them is not going to get us conditionalization, and one of them is. And this relates to the earlier question about kind of putting probabilities over the non-deterministic thing. Okay, so what's the problem? The problem with extending this to the non-deterministic case is that this is no longer defined. Okay, because this said the utility of a particular updating rule at a way the world is just the outcome, the utility of the outcome that I would in fact choose were I to update upon the evidence that I'll get in that world. But if my rule is non-deterministic, then there could be a bunch of ways that I think of as permissible, or my dispositions allow me to update in this particular world. And around the evidence in this world, there's a whole bunch of different things, and so this is no longer defined. And so the question is, how do you define it? And there's basically two ways. You can either fine-grain the sets of possible worlds, or you can keep them as they are, kind of coarse-grained, but then you put probabilities over the different possibilities. First way is not going to get you conditionalization, second way is. Okay, so what do I mean by fine-graining the worlds? Well, basically I want to look at, I want to be able to define, sorry, flipping back and forwards and sort of seasick-inducing man. I want to be able to define this. That's so we're going to define this thing, sorry. So the thing I'm going to try first is to make these more fine-grained so that they specify not only what evidence I get to that world, because that's already specified as partition, whichever element of the partition I get it's in, that's the thing I'll get, but also what my response to that evidence was. So I'm going to fine-grain the worlds so that they specify this thing, what my response to that evidence is going to be. So now I can define the utility of a particular updating rule, one of these fine-grained worlds, which specifies the way the world is, and also how I respond to the evidence I get. in it? Well, it's just going to be the utility of whatever option that response will choose out of this big thing. Okay, do that, and it's going to turn out that the rules that maximize expected fine-grained utility from the point of view of C are going to be the super-conditionalizing rules. Right? So remember, that includes the ones that are non-deterministic, the branching ones, and sometimes even branching ones that don't ever satisfy standard conditionalizing. So if we go the fine-graining way, we're not going to get back anything analogous to Brown's result. We're not going to get to justification of conditionalization. Things are much more hopeful if we go the coarse-grained route. Coarse-graining is actually not kind of the right word. It's like same-graining. It's basically I'm going to keep the same possible worlds, but I'm going to do a trick in order to define how good the rule is at that world. And this, I was going to mention this, I think, just earlier on. This is going to be more plausible in the case of dispositions, if we're thinking of the rules as governing our as describing our dispositions. Because, I mean, this is sort of armchair metaphysics of science, but if you have a disposition, it's not unreasonable to think, maybe that's enough of a head. It's not unreasonable to think that there's some probability for which you will have a particular response to the stimulus in the case of the disposition. So, suppose I have a non-deterministic disposition, so it's not the case that whichever piece of evidence I get, there's just a single credence function that I will for sure adopt, rather than there's a series of them that I might adopt. Then it's not unreasonable to think that given a particular piece of evidence and a particular response to it, there's some probability that I will respond to receiving that evidence by adopting that credence function. So let's just suppose there is such things. I mean, I don't want to hang very much on the metaphysics of science thing here. I just, in a sense, I'm kind of giving the conditionalization arguments as much of a life raft as I can. So suppose you do think this. So now I'm going to define how good an updating rule is by how good it's sort of expected to be. And that is, when it's how good it is at a particular world, is how good I expect the decisions that it's going to make to be, where the expectation is calculated by looking at the different possible responses that I could have to learning that particular piece of evidence I'll get at that world, and making a decision based on that. But if you go that way, then finally, hallelujah, we have an argument genuinely for conditionalization that doesn't assume deterministic updating. So this can genuinely tell you, from a purely pragmatic point of view, not making any assumptions about sort of intuitive assumptions about, say, something like information preservation or evidential support, or how you just somehow should be deterministic in your updating plans. Without any of that, it can tell you why, in fact, you would make better decisions if you were to have deterministic updating plans, and in particular, deterministic updating plans that are conditionalizing plans. They will just do you better when you come to make decisions later in life, if this is how you value those rules. Okay. Oh, right, okay. So, yeah, right. Okay, I'm going to then not say so much about the expected accuracy argument. Why? Well, basically it's the same as the previous argument, but with accuracy put in place of pragmatic utility. So, here we're not looking at the accuracy, there's actually inaccuracy. The inaccuracy of a rule at a particular world is just going to be the inaccuracy of the very credence function it makes you adopt to that world. So Bruce and Wallace define the inaccuracy of a rule that way and get out, if you assume deterministic updating, that your rule should be a conditionalizing rule. If you don't, then exactly the same two options are open. You can either fine-grain the worlds and then define the inaccuracy of your updating rule, one of these fine-grained worlds in the usual way, but then you won't get that conditionalization, you'll get that super-conditionalizing. Or you can coarse-grain in exactly the way I just mentioned, and then you will get that conditionalization. Just one more thing to say about the coarse-graining move, though. And that is, I was talking there as if it's only if you're thinking about dispositions that this is going to be good. This is going to be a reasonable kind of move to make between these probabilities. But, I mean, here's not a totally unreasonable thing to say. Again, I'm not really proposing this, but I'm giving the conditionalization as much for life as I can. You could think, suppose I have a plan, okay, and it's an undeterministic plan. So I think, were I to receive this piece of evidence, were I to receive the hurricane landed in Florida, then I might adopt this, or I might adopt that. Then you might think that a reasonable way of assessing the, say, accuracy of the rule at one of the Florida worlds would be just the average of the accuracy. So you just take all the credence functions that it thinks of as being legitimate, and just take the average of those inaccuracies or accuracies to give the accuracy of the rule, just a straight average. And then, of course, because that's a probability, that the average is going to be a probability, then you're going to get out an argument for conditionalizing that. So it's not like it's just if you think of this as governing dispositions that you get out conditionalizing here. You can also use this trick, modulo a bit of an assumption about taking a straight average to use it for the planning case as well.
So while we're in the realm of doing that, are you open to people having weighted averages, where the weights are something like higher order thoughts, like I might read the book or I might read the newspaper, and if you really pressed me, I'd say probably more like the newspaper, but the plan is open.
Absolutely. I mean, yes, I think I think there could be that sort of higher order thing. Yes, I mean, and we're used to this in other cases, right? You can have a whole bunch of things that are permissible, particularly in kind of non-maximizing decision theories or ethical theories. We're used to cases where a bunch of things can be permissible, but in some sense, that's a bit more permissible than that. All acts are born equal, but some are more equal than others. So I think you could definitely have a similar thing there. You could say, well, look, all of these things pass the threshold such that I will think of them as fine, but really in a way I favour that one, and then I would give maybe more weight to that, something like that. And then of course you'll get the same thing out. You'll get conditionalizing. You just have to have this way of calculating. Okay, good. Final thing, I do want to just mention this, just because things get a bit weird here. So what happens in this case is, in the original accuracy arguments for probabilism, it was all done by accuracy dominance. So what's wrong with having a non-probabilistic Green's function? There's some alternative thing that's guaranteed to be better. That's in all worlds. And there's kind of good reason why, of course, someone like Joyce went that way rather than doing something equivalent to the expected utility thing. But of course, what's the thing that's going to be giving your expectations in the probabilistic case? In this sort of case, as long as you've got a probabilistic prior, you can have something that you can use to calculate the expected values. But nonetheless, Ray Briggs and I were kind of interested in this question of can you give an accuracy dominance argument for conditionalizing? And it turns out that you can. So how do you do this? I mean, what you're going to be judging now, so remember in the expected accuracy case, what you're judging is the rule, and you judge it from the point of view of the prior. What happens in this argument is you judge both of them taken together. They're kind of taken as a pair. And this is why it's not, in a sense, it's not surprising. It's what we're going to get out as a kind of coherence norm, that they should cohere in a particular way. People are interested, it kind of ends up being a wide scope norm rather than the narrow scope norm that the earlier arguments would have justified. So, what the argument says is, look, if I've got to tell you what the accuracy is of this whole combined entity, the prior and the rule together. And the argument's going to be, the accuracy is just going to be the sum of the two of them. You can actually make them weighted sums if you want. But this is the one that we went for and we kind of ran with. So your accuracy of your prior plus the accuracy of your rule, which is given, as in the previous case, by the accuracy of the Green's function, the rule will endorse at that point. If you do that, then it's going to turn out that your accuracy dominated, just in case you're not conditionalizing the rule. So given you don't want to be accuracy dominated, you should be a conditionalizing rule. That's if you're deterministic. What happens if you're non-deterministic? Well, again, you get these two kind of odd, these two possibilities. But something goes kind of strange in the fine-graining case. It basically doesn't get us anything very nice. So one thing you can get is if you are a superconditionalizing rule, then you're not going to be dominated. That's okay. So it turns out that yeah, you're definitely not going to get conditionalization because there are going to be certain things like superconditionalizing rules that are not dominated. But actually, you don't even get superconditionalizing. You're going to get certain non-superconditionalizing ways of updating that are not dominated relative to this kind of fine-grained notion of accuracy. So actually, it turns out that this argument, right, my argument, is it does very badly from this point of view. But happily, we do get conditionalization. Sorry, this is put wrongly. So you can get conditionalization out of this if you use the coarse graining method that I was talking about before, where the accuracy of a rule at a world is this expectation of the accuracy of the posteriors that it endorses. Okay, so just to summarize and kind of round off, where does all this leave us? On the one hand, I started working on this project feeling quite optimistic because so this is the different arguments: diachronic Dutch book argument, expected pragmatic utility argument. That was the kind of Peter Brown one on the fine graining way, on the coarse graining way. This is the expected accuracy argument on fine graining and coarse graining, and the accuracy dominated argument on the fine graining and coarse graining. And just about all of them, except this kind of disastrous one, get you superconditionalizing, so get you some norm. They're not going to be trivial. Not all of them get you conditionalizing, but at least some seem to. Okay. Now the ones that get you them are all coarse graining ones. So none of the fine graining responses give you this. So I ended up being quite positive. I just thought, well, in the end, this just shows that this is the right way to go. We kind of want to preserve conditionalization, so we should go the coarse graining way. The problem is that's not really enough, right? If I'm really going to show that it's not even permissible, if I want to show that it's not permissible to violate conditionalization, I've got to show not only that the coarse graining method is quite a good idea, but that in fact it's mandatory. That it wouldn't even be permissible to value things in the way that the fine graining method does. Because if that's permissible, and those don't end up giving conditionalization, then you're not going to get conditionalization out of it. So I ended up then being a bit pessimistic. And I'm left a bit puzzled, really. So I think there's a puzzle in all of this, that it's not so easy to get conditionalization. But you can get it in these particular ways. But if we're really going to get it as a mandatory rule for updating, we're going to have to say why the fine-graining methods are not legitimate ways of valuing things. And at the moment, I don't really see why that would be the case. Okay, anyway, that's it.